The mob breathes as one great, foul beast. Its lungs are the bellows of the blacksmith shop, its heart the swinging doors of the saloon, and its voice a rising murmur of hate that coils around Alara standing alone in the dust of Redemption Gulch's main street. Torches spit embers into the twilight, painting the hard faces of men in demonic shades of orange and black. They are a wall of judgment, their certainty as solid and unyielding as the mountains that hemmed in the desolate valley. She is the outsider, the mail-order bride whose intended died too soon, too conveniently. She is the blight, the witch, the tidy explanation for a world that often made no sense. Her hands are clenched at her sides, knuckles white, but her chin is high. If she is to die here, choked by rope and prejudice, they will not see her cower. The murmur crests into a roar as Jedediah Thorne, the town's self-appointed patriarch, points a damning finger. She brought death to this town, to good Arthur. She'll not poison us further. A rope is thrown, snaking through the air to land with a soft thud at her feet. This is it. The beast is ready to feed. And in this moment of final, terrifying isolation, a shadow detaches itself from the deep darkness of the livery stable. A man moves with a liquid grace that is at odds with the stiff, angry postures of the mob. He is tall and lean, his features carved by a life lived under the sun and under the weight of others' judgment. Silas, the Freedman Cowboy, a man who existed on the town's periphery, a ghost who broke the wild horses no one else could gentle. He walks not around the mob, but through it. Men part for him, a mixture of surprise and ingrained contempt on their faces. He stops before Alara, his back to the torches, placing himself between her and the rope. He says nothing. He simply raises a hand, calloused and strong, and takes hers. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. His touch is a shock, a brand of warm, living flesh against her cold skin. It is an anchor in the swirling vortex of hate. The beast of the mob falters, its collective breath catching in its throat. A black man defending the white witch. It is an offense against the natural order of things as they understood it, a defiance so profound it momentarily silences them. With that single, silent gesture of taking her hand, Silas has not just taken her side. He has taken on her sentence. His life and hers were now bound together by a thread of impossible courage, spun in the shadow of the gallows. The journey from Chicago had been a rattling, bone-jarring lesson in geography and hope. For Alara, each mile west was a mile further from the suffocating propriety of a life as a poor relation, a burden to be sighed over and shuffled from one spare room to another. The advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had been spare, the words of her intended, Arthur Pendleton, equally so. Seeking a wife. Good character essential. Offer a home and partnership in Redemption Gulch. I am a man of simple means, but honest intentions. His photograph showed a pale man with kind, tired eyes, standing before a small, neat clapboard house. It was more than enough. A home. Partnership. Words that felt like cool water on a parched throat. She had arrived 2 weeks ago. The town's name, Redemption Gulch, had seemed a good omen then. Now it was a bitter irony. The gulch was a gash in the earth, and the town felt like the wound that would not heal. Arthur had been there to meet her at the stagecoach stop, just as promised. He was thinner than his photograph, his handshake frail, his cough a constant, rattling companion. But his eyes were as kind as she'd imagined, and he'd treated her with a shy, formal respect that was a balm to her spirit. He'd shown her the house, her new home, and for 3 days she'd felt the first stirrings of a fragile peace. She had learned the layout of the small general store, the location of the well, and the faces of the townspeople. Faces that were watchful, but not yet hostile. The most prominent face belonged to Jedediah Thorne. He was a bull of a man with a prosperous gut and eyes that inventoried everything and everyone they landed on. He owned the largest ranch in the valley and held the town in his financial grip. He had come calling the second day, ostensibly to welcome her, but his gaze had swept over the small Pendleton property with a covetous air. He'd clapped Arthur on the back with a heartiness that made the smaller man flinch and cough. "Glad to see you've got yourself some help, Arthur," Thorne had boomed, his eyes flicking to Alara. "A strong woman is a fine asset." The word asset had sat poorly with her, as if she were a new plow or a broodmare. Then, on the fourth morning, she had woken to find Arthur cold in his bed. He had passed in his sleep, his battle with consumption finally over. The town doctor, a nervous, bird-like man named Elias Finch, had confirmed it. His lungs were shot through, Dr. Finch had whispered, avoiding her eyes. A mercy, in its way. But the town did not see it as a mercy. They saw it as an opportunity. Whispers started in the saloon, slithering out like smoke from under the door. She'd arrived, and 3 days later, the owner of a modest but well-watered plot of land was dead. Thorne was the one fanning the flames. He spoke of her dark hair, her strange, quiet manner. He hinted at Eastern City wiles, at women who knew of potions and powders. The story shifted, mutated. Arthur hadn't been sick. He'd been bewitched. He hadn't died. He'd been murdered. Suddenly, the property she stood to inherit was not a refuge, but the motive for a crime. Her grief was recast as cold calculation. The townsfolk, already suspicious of any newcomer, found an easy narrative to swallow. It was more exciting than the sad truth of a wasting disease. Silas had seen it all. From his self-imposed exile at the edge of town, where he gentled horses in a dust-choked corral, he was an astute observer of Redemption Gulch's rhythms. He had seen the mail-order bride arrive, a solitary figure with a straight back and a look of quiet determination. He'd seen the way Thorne watched her, the same way a coyote watches a lamb. He'd heard the whispers. He knew how this town worked. It needed scapegoats. For a crop failure, a dry well, a sudden death. For its own meanness of spirit. As a black man in a white world, he knew the precariousness of existence, how quickly acceptance could sour into accusation. He lived that truth every day. He had no stake in Alara's fate. She was a stranger, a white woman whose world was entirely separate from his own. Intervening was not just unwise, it was suicidal. And yet, when he saw the rope, when he saw her face, pale and resolute in the torchlight, refusing to break, something in him shifted. It was the same instinct that allowed him to approach a terrified Mustang, not with force, but with a quiet understanding of its fear. He recognized in her a spirit cornered but unbroken. He knew the feeling, and so he had moved, walking out of the shadows and into the fire, his hand reaching for hers not out of a plan, but out of a profound, inexplicable recognition. The walk away from the stunned mob was the longest of Alara's life. Silas's hand was a firm, warm manacle around her wrist, pulling her along. He didn't look back. His pace was steady, purposeful, cutting a path through the gawking, silent townsfolk. The hate was still there, a physical pressure on her back, but it was now laced with confusion. The beast had been momentarily baffled. They passed the last house, the last flickering lantern of the town, and plunged into the encompassing darkness of the open range. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry ground and the frantic drumming of Alara's own heart. The landscape was alien and immense, the stars cold and distant. She stumbled, her legs feeling like water after the rigid terror of the standoff. Silas's grip tightened, steadying her. He didn't speak a single word until they had put at least a mile of open country between them and Redemption Gulch. His home was little more than a cabin, nestled in a shallow draw and almost invisible against the dark earth until you were nearly upon it. It was small, sturdy, and utterly isolated. A corral stood nearby, the dark shapes of 2 horses shifting within it. This was his world, a world built on being apart, on being unseen. And he had just dragged the most dangerously visible person in the territory right into the center of it. He released her hand only to push open the cabin door. Inside, it was Spartan and clean. A narrow bed was built into one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood before a small stone hearth, and a shelf held a few tins, a sack of flour, and a small, leather-bound book. He lit a single tallow lamp, and the small space filled with a soft, flickering glow. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and dust. The adrenaline that had held Alara together began to drain away, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the floorboards as if they held the answers to 1,000 unaskable questions. What now? What had this man done? What had she allowed him to do? Silas moved without a sound. He didn't look at her, didn't press her for words. He went to the hearth, stirred the embers from an earlier fire, and added a few small pieces of wood. A flame caught, licking the kindling with a gentle crackle. Then he took the single blanket from his bed and draped it over her shoulders. It was coarse wool, but it was warm, and the simple, unspoken gesture of care was so unexpected it nearly broke her. He busied himself making coffee, his movements economical and precise. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavy with everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. It was a different kind of silence than the one she had lived with in her uncle's house, which had been full of unspoken resentments. This was a watchful silence, a silence of assessment. She was assessing him, the quiet, formidable man who had risked everything for a stranger. And he, she knew, was assessing her. He placed a tin mug of steaming black coffee on the table in front of her. He took none for himself. He sat on the other stool, his posture relaxed but alert. He still hadn't spoken. He was giving her space, letting the storm inside her pass. Finally, her voice emerged, a raw whisper. "What?" Silas looked at her then, his gaze direct and unreadable. He considered the question for a long moment, as if weighing each possible answer. His own voice, when it came, was low and resonant, a voice seldom used. "I don't hold with mobs," he said simply. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was enough. It was everything. It told her that his actions weren't about her, not specifically. They were about a principle, a line he had drawn in the dust of his own life that he would not allow men like Thorne to cross. He saw an injustice so profound it outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. He rose and went to the cabin door, standing for a moment and looking out into the impenetrable darkness. "They'll be back," he said, his voice flat with certainty. "Maybe not tonight. They're confused. But Thorne won't let this go. He'll twist it. He'll tell them I stole you. He'll tell them anything he needs to." He turned back to face her, his expression grim. "You're not safe here. Fact is, you made me unsafe here, too." The truth of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her survival had come at the cost of his. "I'm sorry," she breathed, the words wholly inadequate. "I never meant. Meaning's got little to do with it." He cut in, not unkindly. He picked up a rifle that had been leaning against the wall, checking its action with unpracticed familiarity. "You should get some sleep. Take the bed. Where will you sleep?" He gestured with his chin toward the door. "Here." There was no arguing. He was the protector. She was the protected. It was a dynamic set in stone by his actions in the street. She slid onto the narrow bed, pulling the blanket he'd given her tighter. It still smelled faintly of him, of horse and leather and the clean scent of the open air. She lay stiffly, listening to the sounds of him banking the fire and the soft thud as he sat on the floor, his back against the door, the rifle across his lap. In the deep, terrifying quiet of the night, the sound of another person breathing was the only comfort in the world. She had escaped a lynch mob only to find herself in a different kind of trap, a cage built of gratitude and obligation, shared with a man whose life she had just ruined. The first days in the cabin unfolded in a slow, silent rhythm of shared existence. Words were a scarce commodity, reserved for the purely necessary. "The water bucket is low. There's firewood to be split. I'm going to check the horse traps." Their communication was a thing of gesture and observation. Alara learned that Silas rose before the sun, moving with a cat-like quiet that rarely disturbed her. He would be gone for hours, checking the string of wild mustangs he was in the process of taming or hunting for game. He would return as silently as he left, sometimes with a rabbit or a brace of quail, which he would clean and prepare with an efficient, no-nonsense air. Alara, in turn, made the cabin her domain. It was a tacit agreement, an unspoken division of labor that gave shape to their precarious life together. She scrubbed the floorboards, mended the small tears in his work shirts with thread pulled from her own petticoat, and learned to make a passable stew from dried beans and whatever meat he provided. She discovered a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin and set about reviving it, her hands digging into the cool, dark earth with a fierce determination. The work was grounding. It was real. It kept the terror at bay, pushing it back to the quiet hours just before dawn. In this shared silence, they began to learn each other. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be incredibly gentle as he worked a knot out a horse's mane. She watched him one afternoon as he sat by the corral, speaking to a wild-eyed filly in a low, calming murmur, his voice a tool of patience and persuasion. He never used force when patience would do. It was a philosophy that seemed to extend to her as well. He never pressed her about what had happened in town. He let her be. He, in turn, observed her. He saw the efficiency of her movements, the way she could make a meager meal feel like a feast. He noticed the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she weeded the garden, her face smudged with dirt. He saw a strength in her that had nothing to do with physical power. It was a resilience, a refusal to be broken by circumstance. One evening, he came in to find her staring into the fire, her hands twisting in her lap, her expression one of naked fear. He said nothing, but he laid a freshly picked sprig of wild sage on the table beside her. Its clean, sharp scent filled the small space. When she looked up, he was already tending to his rifle, but she understood the gesture. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, a small offering of comfort in a world that had offered her none. The outside world intruded on their third day together. Two riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the draw, their silhouettes sharp against the bright morning sky. Alara's heart leaped in her throat. Silas, who had been repairing a bridle by the cabin door, didn't even look up. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and even. She scrambled into the cabin, pressing herself against the wall beside the single window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The riders were from Redemption Gulch. She recognized one of them as a crony of Thorne's, a man named Cobb. They rode down into the draw slowly, their rifles held across their saddles. It was not a social call. Silas rose to his feet, the bridle still in his hand. He didn't reach for his own rifle, which leaned against the doorframe just inside the cabin. He simply stood there, waiting, a picture of calm defiance. "Silas," Cobb called out, reining his horse a few yards away. His tone was a mix of condescension and menace. "Thorne sent us. He's worried about that woman. Says you took her against her will." "She came with me," Silas replied, his voice flat. "That ain't what it looked like," the other man sneered. "Looked like you were snatching her. Thorne wants her brought back. For her own protection." "She's protected here," Silas said. His gaze was steady, fixed on Cobb. Cobb shifted in his saddle, his eyes darting to the cabin, then back to Silas. He was trying to intimidate him, but Silas was an immovable object. There was a power in his stillness that the two blustering men couldn't quite fathom. They were used to fear, to deference. Silas offered neither. "Now look here," Cobb started, his voice rising. "You're in a whole heap of trouble, harboring a murderess, and you, of all people. The marshal's on his way. You give her up now, it'll go easier on you." "I've got work to do," Silas said, turning his back on them, as if they were no more than a minor annoyance. He walked over to the corral, picked up a rope, and began coiling it with deliberate slowness. The blatant dismissal was more effective than any threat. Cobb and his companion looked at each other, uncertain. To force the issue would mean a real fight, and something in Silas's demeanor suggested it wouldn't be an easy one. Frustrated and unnerved, Cobb spat into the dust. "You'll hang for this, Silas. Both of you. Thorne will see to it." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. Only when they were gone did Alara realize she had been holding her breath. She sagged against the wall, her legs trembling. Silas came back inside, his face a grim mask. "They'll be back," he said, stating the obvious, "and they'll bring more men." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoicism in his eyes. It looked like weariness. The weight of his decision was settling on his shoulders. That night, a new tension filled the cabin. The confrontation had shattered their fragile peace. The danger was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It had a face and a name. It was Cobb. It was Thorn. Alara looked at Silas as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight, his movements precise and methodical. The thought that had been a dull ache in her mind became a sharp, stabbing pain. This man would die because of her. She had brought the lynch mob to his door. "You should have let them take me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the flickering light. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I shouldn't have." "They'll kill you," she insisted, the words tasting like ash. "For me, a stranger. It's not just about you anymore, is it?" he said quietly. "They came to my home. They made their threats on my land. This is my fight now, too." His words didn't absolve her of her guilt, but they did change its shape. It was no longer her burden alone. It was theirs, a shared weight. The realization was both terrifying and strangely comforting. In the face of certain danger, they had ceased to be a protector and a refugee. They were becoming partners. That night, when she lay down on the narrow bed, the fear was still there, but was accompanied by a new feeling, a fierce, desperate desire to protect the man who was sleeping on the floor by the door, guarding their shared, impossible fight. The days that followed were taught with a new kind of intimacy, one forged in the crucible of shared danger. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer a silence of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for constant chatter. It was the silence of a shared watch, of knowing the other was there, alert and present. Their fragile alliance was tested a week after Cobb's visit. Their supplies were running perilously low. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee was gone. Redemption Gulch was an impossibility, a hornet's nest they dared not approach. Silas announced he would ride to Harmony Creek, a smaller, more remote settlement a day's ride to the west. "I should go," Alara said immediately. "They're looking for you as much as me now. If I'm not with you, maybe you can pass without notice." Silas considered this, his gaze distant. "No, too dangerous for you alone. We go together." The decision was final. They left before sunrise the next morning, Silas on his steady gelding and Alara on the gentle filly he had been training. The filly was responsive and calm, a testament to Silas's patient methods. Riding beside him, moving across the vast, silent landscape, Alara felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time since arriving in the West, she felt like a participant in her own life, not just a victim of it. Harmony Creek was little more than a dusty crossroads with a general store, a blacksmith, and a few scattered houses. It was blessedly free of familiar faces from Redemption Gulch. Silas had her wait with the horses in a stand of cottonwoods while he went into the store. She watched him walk down the street, his stride long and easy, and felt a pang of anxiety. He was so visible, so alone. He emerged a few minutes later, his face set like stone. He was empty-handed. "What is it?" she asked as he approached. "Word travels," he said, his voice tight. "Sheriff from Redemption Gulch sent a rider out yesterday. There's a notice. For you. A $200 bounty. For the witch who murdered Arthur Pendleton. $1,000. The sum was staggering. It was enough to make a man rich. It was enough to turn any stranger into an enemy, any neighbor into a potential Judas. "And for you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked away, busying himself with tightening his saddle cinch. 500, for aiding and abetting a fugitive. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. They were no longer just outcasts. They were commodities. Their lives had been assigned a monetary value. The storekeeper in Harmony Creek, seeing Silas, a black man, and likely guessing who the woman waiting in the trees was, had refused to sell to him. He'd told him to move on before he sent for the law. They rode back to the cabin in grim silence, the failure of their mission hanging heavy between them. The isolation that had been a sanctuary now felt like a prison. They were cut off, surrounded by a world that had put a price on their heads. That evening, the mood in the cabin was bleak. They ate the last of the beans, a meager, tasteless meal. The fear that Alara had been holding at bay came crashing back in, cold and suffocating. She saw the gallows in her mind, not just one rope, but two. She looked over at Silas. He was staring into the fire, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than mere physical exhaustion. He had taken on her fight, and it was costing him everything. His home, his safety, his very life. An impulse, born of desperation and a deep, burgeoning affection, seized her. She got up and walked over to the hearth where he sat on his stool. He looked up, his eyes questioning. She didn't speak. She knelt before him, took the rough tin plate from his hands, and set it aside. Then, she gently took his hands in hers. They were rough, crisscrossed with the scars of rope burns and hard labor. But they were the hands that had reached for her in the street, the hands that had steadied her, the hands that built the fire that kept her warm. She brought them to her cheek, pressing his callous skin against hers. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a confession of everything she couldn't say. "Thank you. I am sorry. You're not alone." He stiffened for a moment, surprised. Then, slowly he relaxed. He turned one of his hands over and lightly touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, gentle, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. In that moment, the barriers between them, of race, of circumstance, of fear, seemed to dissolve into the warm, fire-lit air. They were just a man and a woman, clinging to each other in a hostile world. He let out a long, slow breath. "Alara," he said, her name a soft murmur in the quiet cabin. It was the first time he had spoken it with such tenderness. The moment was shattered by a sound from outside, the sharp crack of a twig, too deliberate to be an animal. Instantly, Silas was on his feet, pulling her up with him and pushing her toward the back of the cabin. He grabbed his rifle, his body transforming from weary stillness to lethal alertness. "Stay down," he commanded in a harsh whisper. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. Alara crouched behind the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence outside stretched, thick with menace. Then a voice, oily and familiar, cut through the night. "We know you're in there, Silas. You and the witch." It was Thorn. "The marshal's with me. Come on out with your hands up." This was it. The hunt was over. They were cornered. Silas glanced back at her, his eyes dark with a grim resolve. He was not a man who would be taken easily. He was preparing to fight, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a fight would only end one way. They would die here, in this cabin, their story ending in a hail of bullets and lies. "Don't," she whispered, her voice desperate. "Don't fight them." A new idea, terrifying and bold, was taking root in the scorched earth of her fear. Hiding was over. Running was over. There was only one path left. "Silas," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He says the marshal is with him." Silas looked at her, his expression uncomprehending. "He's a territorial marshal, Alara. Bought and paid for by Thorn, most likely." "Maybe," she said, getting to her feet. "But he represents the law, not mob rule. Thorn's lies, they sound good in a saloon, shouted by torchlight. But they might not sound so good in the quiet of day." Spoken to a federal officer, she took a deep breath, the plan solidifying in her mind. "Arthur was sick, Silas. He was dying long before I ever came here. And Thorn knew it. He wanted that land." She began to pace the small cabin, the pieces falling into place. "Arthur told me Thorn kept visiting, pressuring him to sell, offering a pitiful price. Arthur always refused. The day before he died, Thorn came to the house. Arthur was having a bad spell, coughing terribly. Thorn offered to fetch his laudanum from Dr. Finch. He came back with it. He told me he'd given Arthur a dose." Her voice trembled as the memory sharpened, its significance finally crashing down on her. "He said Dr. Finch had recommended a stronger dose for the pain." Silas was listening intently now, the rifle held loosely at his side. He saw where she was going. It was a desperate gamble, her word against the most powerful man in the valley. Dr. Finch, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He's a mouse of a man, terrified of Thorn. He is, Alara agreed. But he's also a doctor. He keeps records. And maybe, just maybe, his conscience is stronger than his fear. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Silas, her eyes pleading. We can't win by hiding. We can't win by fighting. The only way we win is with the truth. We have to go out there. We have to face them. Outside, Thorn's voice called again, impatient and angry. Last chance, Silas, or we burn you out. Silas looked from the door to Alara's face. He saw not the terrified woman he had rescued, but a warrior. Her fear was still there, but it was now tempered with a cold, hard resolve. She was right. Their sanctuary had become a trap. Hiding had only allowed Thorn's lies to grow and fester. Their only weapon was the one thing Thorn couldn't control, the truth, however fragile. He nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between them. This was the final stand, not with bullets, but with words. He laid his rifle on the table, a gesture of profound trust in her and in the desperate course she had set. All right, he said, his voice steady. We face them. He walked to the door and took a deep breath. He looked back at her one last time, and in his eyes she saw not just grim resolve, but a fierce, burning pride. Together, he lifted the bar from the door and pulled it open, stepping out into the moonlight to face their executioners. Alara walked out behind him, her head held high, her hand finding his and lacing her fingers through his. Their clasped hands were not a symbol of rescue now, but of an unbreakable, defiant union. The clearing in front of the cabin was crowded with horsemen, their forms stark in the cold moonlight. Jedediah Thorn sat on his large bay horse at the forefront, a triumphant smirk on his face. Beside him sat a man with a silver star pinned to his vest, the territorial marshal. He was a hard-faced man with weary, cynical eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's rough justice. The rest of the men were the familiar faces from a mob, their expressions a mixture of grim satisfaction and bloodlust. When Silas and Alara emerged, hand in hand, a murmur went through the posse. Thorn's smirk widened. Well, he boomed, his voice dripping with false righteousness. Look what crawled out. The killer and her keeper. Marshal, I told you we'd find them holed up together. It's indecent. The marshal's gaze flickered over Silas and Alara, lingering on their joined hands. He said nothing, his face impassive. It's over, Alara, Thorn said, addressing her directly, his tone oozing a predatory pity. There's a bounty on your head, a rope waiting in Redemption Gulch. Confess now. Tell the marshal how you poisoned poor Arthur for his property. Maybe he'll show you some mercy. Alara felt Silas's hand tighten around hers, a silent message of support. She drew strength from it, from the solid, unwavering presence of the man beside her. She took a step forward, her voice clear and steady in the night air, carrying to every man present. I did not kill Arthur Pendleton, she said. He died of consumption, a sickness he fought for years. A sickness you were well aware of, Mr. Thorn. Thorn chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Lies. The desperate lies of a cornered witch. Is it a lie that you visited him almost daily in the week before he died? Alara continued, her voice rising in strength. Is it a lie that you repeatedly offered to buy his land for a fraction of its worth? Did you not tell him his sickness made him unfit to run it? A few of the men in the posse shifted uneasily. They all knew of Thorn's appetite for land. The seed of doubt, small and fragile, had been planted. He was my friend, Thorn roared, his face purpling with rage. I was trying to help him. You helped him to his grave, Alara shot back, her words like stones. The day before he died, you came to his house. He was weak in great pain. You volunteered to fetch his medicine. You brought back a bottle of laudanum from Dr. Finch. The marshal's gaze sharpened, a flicker of professional interest in his tired eyes. He was listening now. You gave him a dose yourself, Alara said, her eyes locked on Thorn's. You told me the doctor had recommended a stronger dose to ease his suffering. You administered it with your own hands. Thorne's face had gone pale in the moonlight. "You're mad. I did no such thing." "Then let's ask Dr. Finch," Elara said, her voice ringing with conviction. She turned her attention to the marshal. "Sir, I am not a murderer. I am the victim of this man's greed. All I ask is that you ride to Redemption Gulch and put the question to Dr. Elias Finch. Ask him about the laudanum Jedediah Thorne purchased on the last day of Arthur Pendleton's life. Ask him if he recommended an overdose. His records will show the purchase. His conscience, I pray, will show the truth." A heavy silence fell over the clearing. Alara's challenge hung in the air, simple, direct, and devastatingly plausible. It was her word against Thorne's, but she had offered a path to verification. Thorne, who had been so confident, so utterly in control, was now sputtering, his bluster failing him. "She's lying. The doctor is a fool. He'll say anything." But it was too late. The marshal had heard enough. He had seen this play out before. The powerful man, the convenient scapegoat, the lie that was just a little too neat. He looked from Thorne's panicked face to Alara's resolute one. He saw the quiet, powerful dignity of the black man standing beside her, a man who had risked everything for a truth he believed in. The marshal turned his horse to face Thorne squarely. "Is that so, Jedediah?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Well, I suppose we'll just have to ride into town and have a chat with this foolish doctor ourselves. In the meantime," he said, his hand moving with surprising speed to draw his pistol, "you're under my authority. You and your men will stand down." The posse, their mob certainty shattered by doubt and the marshal's drawn gun, began to back away, their loyalty to Thorne dissolving in the face of federal authority. Thorne looked around, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had lost control. The narrative he had so carefully crafted had been torn to shreds by a woman who refused to be a victim and a man who refused to be afraid. The marshal dismounted, his eyes never leaving Thorne. "You tried to use me to sanction a lynching, Thorne. I don't take kindly to that." He walked over to Alara and Silas. He looked at their joined hands, and for the first time, a glimmer of something like respect entered his weary eyes. "Mong, sir, it seems you'll be my witnesses." The threat was not just neutralized, it was broken. The power had shifted. As the marshal began to disarm a protesting Thorne, Alara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. He put his arm around her, holding her steady. They stood together in the moonlight, two outcasts who had faced down the beast and won, not with violence, but with the fragile, unyielding power of the truth. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a stark contrast to their flight from it. They rode with the marshal, no longer fugitives, but accusers. Thorne, stripped of his rifle and his authority, rode sullenly ahead, a prisoner in his own domain. The posse had melted away, its members vanishing back into the landscape, eager to distance themselves from Thorne's spectacular downfall. As they entered the town, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the main street. A few early risers stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe at the sight of Thorne under the marshal's guard, with Silas and Alara riding freely beside them. The confrontation with Dr. Finch was brief and decisive. Awakened by the marshal's insistent banging, the small, nervous doctor at first tried to equivocate, his eyes darting fearfully toward Thorne. But under the marshal's stern, implacable questioning and away from Thorne's immediate influence, his professional integrity, however frayed, finally won out over his fear. With trembling hands, he produced his ledger. It showed the sale of a large, lethal quantity of laudanum to Jedediah Thorne. He said it was for a horse with a broken leg, Finch stammered, refusing to look at his former patron. "I told him the dose was far too strong for a man. He insisted. It was all the marshal needed." Thorne's guilt was sealed. Justice, swift and undeniable, had finally come to Redemption Gulch. As the marshal led a shackled and defeated Thorne to the town's small jail, a quiet fell over the street. The people who had formed the lynch mob just nights before now stood in silent, awkward groups, avoiding Alara's gaze. Some had the decency to look ashamed. They had been so certain, so eager to believe the worst, and they had been proven catastrophically wrong. The marshal turned to Alara and Silas before he left. "The Pendleton property is legally yours, ma'am, by the terms of Mr. Pendleton's will, which I'll see is filed correctly. Your name is cleared." He tipped his hat. "You're free to go." Free. The word felt immense, foreign. Alara looked at Silas, standing beside her in the morning light. His face was calm, his posture relaxed. The long vigil was over. She had her name back. She had a home. But looking at the small clapboard house at the end of the street, Arthur's house, she felt no pull toward it. Her sanctuary, her true home, was the small, isolated cabin in the draw. Her partner was the man standing beside her. Without a word, they turned and began the walk back to the horses. As they passed the general store, the owner who had once refused Silas service now stood on his porch, looking at the ground. He didn't speak, but the gesture was a clear, if grudging, admission of respect. A small shift had occurred in the town's harsh firmament. They rode out of Redemption Gulch in silence, leaving the town and its ghosts behind them. When they reached the ridge overlooking the draw where the cabin lay nestled, they paused. The land, which had so recently felt like a prison, now stretched before them full of peace and possibility. It was their own small piece of the world, earned and defended. They spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet decompression. The tension that had been their constant companion for weeks had finally drained away, leaving a peaceful, pleasant exhaustion in its place. Alara worked in her garden, her hands sinking into the soil, feeling the simple, profound joy of tending to new life. Silas worked with the filly in the corral, his low voice a soothing murmur on the afternoon air. That evening, they sat on the small porch of the cabin, watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of purple and gold. The world was vast and beautiful. Alara was no longer the accused mail-order bride, and Silas was no longer just the outcast cowboy. They were survivors. They were partners. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, a sound of pure contentment. Silas reached over and took her hand. It was the same gesture that had started it all, in a street full of hate and torches. But this time it was different. It wasn't a desperate act of rescue. It was a quiet question, a simple statement of belonging. She turned her hand in his, lacing her fingers firmly through his. He looked at her, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "You're safe now, Alara," he said softly. She smiled back, her heart full. She looked out at the land, their land, and then back at the man beside her. "We're safe," she corrected him gently. And in the quiet of the fading light, they both knew they were finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.